Roger, transpersonal psychology is a new field. Some say it's new agey. Others say that it's a window to a new reality. How do you define it, and what does it mean?
Well, perhaps the best way of describing it is to talk just a little bit about how it came into being, because Western clinical psychology really began with the first school of psychoanalysis, which focused particularly on pathology and dealing with that. And then there was a school of behaviorism, which looked at external behavior and reinforcers in the environment. But both those left quite a bit out. There was a focus on pathology, there was a focus on reflexes and reinforcement. There wasn't much about what is a human being. There wasn't much about love or compassion or joy or wisdom. So the kind of higher reaches of who we are got totally left out. So transpersonal psychology emerged as a school which was really concerned with looking at the whole person, not just what we could rigorously analyze with scientific behavioral research, not just at pathology, but at questions of what is psychological health? What is well-being? What are the potentials we're able to reach through various kinds of psychological trainings? And as people began to explore that, it began to be apparent that we've really underestimated our psychological capacities. And so transpersonal psychology increasingly came to look at the higher stages of adult development, and also to look at a family of experiences from which it took its name, that is transpersonal experiences. And transpersonal experiences are experiences which have been described throughout history as experiences in which people get a sense of themselves as being larger than this little skin-encapsulated ego. They get a sense of our interconnection with other people, with the world, even with the universe. Even sometimes a sense of unity, appreciation that we are intimately part of the larger world and family of human beings.
So these are experiences that transpersonal psychology would take seriously as opposed to dismissing as some artificial artifact.
Exactly. And in doing so, it began to be able to make use of a vast reservoir of human exploration and experience from various contemplative and meditative and yogic traditions, all of which have, very interestingly, as one of their goals, the cultivation of just these experiences. It's very interesting that every major religious tradition, every contemplative tradition, values these transpersonal experiences and says they are among the most valuable experiences a human being could have. Now, that's a pretty extraordinary claim. Well, the question is, do they have any validity? Well, we should probably check them out and find out. So the question is, how do we research these experiences, these states of consciousness, bringing the best of Western science and psychology to bear on the question, while also appreciating, or at least being willing to honor, the timeless wisdom of the traditions which originally described them.
So what does a transpersonal psychologist do other than listen and get involved in these anecdotes of different people's experiences? Is there a science? Is there a psychotherapy? How does it work?
All of the above, yes. Certainly there are a lot of researchers in this area. And of course, one thing we need to notice is that this has now become more mainstream. There's a whole field of so-called positive psychology looking at psychological health and well-being. And that was one of the initial areas of concern for transpersonal psychologists. What is a healthy person? We have an enormous amount of information about what psychopathology is. We know almost nothing about what a healthy person is. That's crazy. We should study this. And that's what one of the things transpersonal psychologists have done, both through psychological testing, through interview, and through in some cases, electrophysiological studies, using any technique that is available. And what we're finding is something very remarkable, and that is, to me, this is one of the most exciting discoveries of psychology in the last few decades, is that adults can grow. We used to believe that the brain and body, the mind, let me try that again, please. We used to seriously believe that the mind stopped growing about the time the body stopped growing. That's crazy. And now we know, of course, that adults can continue to mature throughout the lifespan. And that, in point of fact, there are clear, discernible stages of development or levels of development that can be recognized. And interestingly enough, and this is how this comes back to transpersonal, as people mature, some of the experiences they start to have become increasingly transpersonal. They become increasingly what we used to call spiritual in some ways, because people who are very psychologically healthy tend to experience more love, more joy, more compassion, qualities which traditionally we thought of as associated with spiritual traditions or contemplative traditions.
Is there any aspect of transpersonal psychology that looks, how shall I say, beyond the physical to so-called parapsychological phenomena?
Well, that's really a different field. Parapsychology has been the study of, for example, psychic phenomena and so forth. And that hasn't been really a part of transpersonal psychology. I assume most transpersonal psychologists would be open to that possibility and would want to look at the evidence. And, I find it an intriguing area of study, but it's not something I'm involved in.
What about the relationship between transpersonal psychology and different religious points of view, different worldviews? Does transpersonal psychology take its own worldview, or is it very egalitarian for all worldviews?
Well, I think ideally we like to think of ourselves as egalitarian. Of course, you can't live without some belief system, and we all bring our biases to bear on whatever we're investigating. But I think ideally the quest for investigation of these remarkable experiences, historically best known as mystical experiences, the best approach is to bring as few presuppositions as possible to bear and to just see what the evidence tells us and then to research these phenomena.
What is the mechanisms of psychotherapy from a transpersonal point of view?
Well, I think one of the things that transpersonal psychologists emphasize is the recognition that the psyche seems to have inherent in it a tendency to grow. That is, if people are given a safe environment in which they feel free to open themselves, to let down their defenses, then they tend to grow, they tend to heal, to let go their old fearful ways of being and open up and explore new possibilities. Now that isn't a new discovery. It's actually a perennial idea that has been rediscovered throughout history. And guess what? Psychologists are catching up with ancient wisdom once again. So I think that's a very important thing. And once you begin to understand that the mind has this extraordinary capacity, it's actually a self-organizing, self-healing, self-actualizing, and self-transcending organ, then the question becomes, what are the optimal conditions we can make available to both an individual person and to whole societies that will enable people to grow and mature as fully as possible?
What are some case studies along these lines in psychotherapy in which a transpersonal approach has been useful?
Well, for myself, I found it extraordinarily valuable being in therapy with a person who was open to transpersonal experiences, because for myself, I found that as the deeper I explored my own psyche and the whole range of experiences, the more I began to have experiences of greater joy and love, much more than I'd ever expected, and also began to appreciate that, it's true. We really do have this intimate connection. We really do have a sense of being related to others and the world. And I think if I'd been with someone who wasn't sympathetic to those ideas or those experiences, who hadn't experienced them himself, then I suspect he might have looked at me askew and I would have shut down and got defensive.
Take a case that a person might have some anxiety, some phobia. Could transpersonal psychology help in that case?
Well, one person I think of came with a lot of fear. and had spent his life being run by fear. And the trouble with fear is the more you run from it, the more it grows. So he was delighted to find that in both psychotherapy and through the meditation practice he was exploring, that he could begin to investigate and explore fear. And the more he investigated, the more closely he looked, the more he found he didn't have to be afraid of his fear. And that's an amazing discovery for a lot of people, that we actually are afraid of our fear and it keeps growing and cycling. But when we turn attention back to it, when we use, for example, a meditative precision to really look at what it is, then we realize, well, it's a sensation here and it's a little emotion there and it's this and that. But hey, I don't have to be afraid of this. And I certainly don't have to limit my life because of it.
So how do you look at the future of transpersonal psychology?
Well, I think there are several trends. One is it is becoming part of the mainstream. When transpersonal psychology began, it wasn't okay to talk about spirituality. Now the American Psychological Association practically has a printing press that runs books on spirituality. So that's one thing. I think we will begin to draw more on the wisdom of the contemplative traditions. I think we'll ideally marry that with the best of psychological and neuroscientific research. And I think perhaps most exciting of all, we'll begin to investigate what are the farther reaches of human potential. What are the higher stages of development? Those we're just beginning to explore, and they're probably the most exciting of all because it's very clear that we all have capacities and developmental potentials that we're only just beginning to appreciate. In fact, researchers have now discovered 12 psychological capacities in advanced meditators that they formerly thought were totally impossible. That's pretty amazing, and we're just beginning. Who knows where we're going to end up?